right, so good morning, everybody. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. If you're joining us for the first time, and we do have a few new groups today across Mexico, which is really, really exciting in our YouTube chat bar, we are all about bringing exploration, science, and conservation into classrooms around the world. It has been so thrilling having you guys join us live on YouTube and beyond as we continue to celebrate such amazing people from across the globe. So as many of our longtime viewers will know, our bread and butter is epic exploration and adventure. Yesterday we talked about going around the world in pursuit of volcanoes. Tomorrow we've got studying okapi in the West African rainforest. So today we are taking a complete break from all of that. We're doing something entirely different. I'm really, really excited about it, and I hope you guys are as well. So we are joined live at University College London by Dr. Tobias Hauser. So he is the head of their Max Planck Center for Computational Psychology and Aging Research. And today we are going to dive into learning about the brain with your smartphone. We're going to learn about brains in general, and then we're going to dive in with a really, really cool app and an opportunity that all our students tuning in today have to take part and contribute their own data to some really cool science. So without further ado, Tobias, thank you so much for joining us today. I cannot wait to dive in and take us away.
Hello, Jesse, and hello, everyone. And thanks so much for having me. I am really excited about being here, and I am very much looking forward to tell you today about how brains grow up. So, as Jesse said, my name is Tobias Hauser, and that's a picture of myself standing in front of a huge machine, which I will tell you much more about a bit later today, which is the thing that we use to study brains. And I've heard from Jesse that you are scattered all over North of America, Mexico, Canada, and so on. That's amazing. I am currently speaking from you from a slightly different place of the world. I am based in England, in lovely old Europe, and more precisely in London, the town or city with the double-decker buses and the red phone booth. And I work, as Jesse said, at University College London, which is a university in the center of London, where we do a lot of brain research, trying to understand how our brains work. And the thing that drives me out, and the thing that I do for a living and that I am really excited about, is this thing that we have up here. The thing that is behind our eyes, between our ears, underneath our hair, inside this thick bone, the skull. And this is the brain. And today I'll tell you all I know about the brain, all we know about the brain, and I'll try to convince you why the brain is a really, really cool thing. And I know you've been exploring with people in volcanoes, you heard about whales off the shore of Madagascar, but I believe even the brain is really cool, and without this thing, the brain, you would not be able to do any of the other things that you hear about what other explorers tell you. So today I'm going to talk about the brain, and I'll talk about three different things. First of all, I'll try to tell you about what is actually this thing which we call the brain. What is that? Because do we really know? Then I'll tell you more about how we study the brain. So how do we do and to learn more about the brain and how it works? And in the end, I'll tell you about how the brain grows up and how we've developed new ways, including the smartphone app, to study how the brain grows up. So what is this thing that is kind of sits behind our eyes in here? What is it? Like, what is the brain? Well, first of all, maybe like even why should the brain be interesting? And as I said, like you get very exciting, hear a lot about exciting things like volcanoes that make huge fireworks and so on. But you wouldn't be able to see a volcano if it wasn't for your brain. And I assume you're all sitting somewhere in your classroom right now and watching at the screen or a projector, and you're probably seeing my face, talking, and without the brain you wouldn't actually be able to see me, because what is happening at the moment is that your eyes are seeing some colors and some shades, and they all go into your eyes. But the eyes doesn't recognize that at the moment there is a human speaking. It's only your brain that turns this information about light and darkness into a thing which is a person that is talking to you and that you recognize. And that's exactly what the brain is doing. The brain is responsible for many, many different things. And one of the key things that it is responsible for is perception. So everything you see, everything you perceive, other people that you see around, everyone, the movie that you see me talking, the slides here, that's all only taking place in your brain, because the brain is the machine that translates all these visual information, all these slides, into something meaningful. And this is not only true for everything we see, the brain is actually really at the center of everything that comes into us, our bodies. So also, you hear me talking. What happens there? Well, your ears hear some sounds, but only your brain is the thing that turns these sounds into meaningful words and sentences. Without your brain, you wouldn't be able to listen to music or hear other people speak, and certainly you would not be able to understand what someone from London is telling you. And so the brain really is this central hub in our body which integrates all the information, and everything you see, you hear, you touch even, all of that is only taking place in your brain. It needs the brain for it to take place. But that's not the only thing that the brain does. In fact, the brain does much more than that. So for example, it is also responsible for our feelings, which we call emotions. So if you are getting very excited like I am at the moment, here watching and hearing about the brain, well, that is your brain's doing. If you're happy, that is your brain. If you're sad, that is also taking place in your brain. And if you're slightly bored and maybe think you'd rather be outside on the playground, well, that also is your brain. And we know now that there are specific brain chemicals that are responsible for these different feelings and emotions. And so if you're really angry, your brain is the thing that makes you angry, and that maybe also calms you down after a while. But the brain is not just this emotional bundle, it is also responsible for everything we think. So if you are sitting there understanding what I'm saying, thinking about, well, what is this brain doing? That is your brain again doing. But the brain is responsible for all of the things we think. If you think of, I'd rather be outside because this is not so interesting to me, then that's your brain as well. But also, school really is just training your brain. So all we do, like math, reading, even singing, all of that is taking place in your brain, because the brain is the machine that translates what you see into meaningful concepts. And last but not least, lets you act based on that. So everything, all your behaviors are also driven by your brain. So if it's just moving your index finger, well, where does this command come from? Why does the muscle know that it has to contract? Well, it's because the brain tells it to. So it's the brain that, based on everything we feel about, we think about, tells your body how to move and behave. And that can be, as I said, a little move with your index finger. It can also be something much more complex, like riding a bicycle or doing a handstand or other crazy things. And so really the brain is sitting at the center of all we humans do, perceive, and behave. Everything you do is taking place in your brain. So this brain, must be pretty amazing, I think. But what is it? What is this brain that I've been talking about? And if we look at it, well, it is just a simple organ. We have many different organs in our body. We have a heart, we have lungs, we have kidneys, other organs, lots of different organs, and the brain is just one of them. And to be honest, it is actually quite a common thing to have a brain. So yes, humans have brains, but actually almost all of the animals also have a brain. So even like animals that you might not think they are that intelligent, or that you would doubt they have a brain, they indeed have a brain. So for example, do you know these fruit flies? The flies that start, these tiny little things that start flying around when your apples or bananas are getting a bit older, lying on the table. Well, these small little creatures, they do have a brain, and it's a pretty amazing one, which is why many scientists dedicate their lives to study these small flies' brains. And maybe we can talk a bit later about why they are so interested in fruit flies. But also other animals like fish have quite complex brain, like the zebrafish, or animals that some people might like and others maybe hate, like the rat. They have pretty big brains, as you can see here. They are quite complicated thinkers. And it's not only small animals that have brain, but every animal has a brain. Even the biggest of animals, like this whale, they have gigantic brains. And you can see here a picture of a human brain on the right side and a whale brain on the left side. And you can see that the brain of the whale is just so much bigger than a human brain. So we humans, we don't have a particularly big brain, which is because like those animals, whales, are also quite a bit bigger than we are. And indeed, if we look here at the size of the brain, we can see that goldfish, yeah, don't have the biggest brains, but they're also quite tiny. Whereas the biggest brains in the animal kingdom is what the whales and the elephants have, because they are the biggest animals, as far as I know. And you can see here, Homo sapiens, that's us humans, we seem to be doing quite well. We have a relatively big brain compared to other species, and especially compared to how big our body size is. So, what is this brain that I've been talking about? It's an organ, okay, but how can it do all these amazing things that I've just been talking about? Well, let's go with the facts. The brain is about 1.5 kilo, which I think in the US is about 3 pounds, if I'm not wrong, which is a big cauliflower. That's about the weight of a brain. So it's actually it's quite light, because that's a brain of an adult, which we usually 60 to 80 kilos. So it's like the brain is actually a very small part of our body. And if you were to try to understand how it feels like, so if you were to, let's say, cut open my skull and just touch it, then it would feel and have the consistency like a ripe avocado. So you can feel like it's a bit glibbery, but fairly consistent and concise. And it actually, the brain has quite a lot of similarities with the avocado, to be honest, because it primarily consists of fat and water. And in fact, 3/4 of the brain are just pure water. So the brain is literally just a huge bag of water. But how is a huge bag of water able to do all these amazing things like watch a movie or do the handstand? Well, it is because the brain has a special ingredient, which are the brain cells, or we call them neurons. And the brain has many of them. These cells are really small, and you can put a lot of these small cells into this cauliflower-sized balloon of water. In fact, we have over 86 billion brain cells. That is a huge number. This is 10 times more than the number of humans that are currently living on planet Earth. So just think of everyone who lives on planet Earth, and then times 10, and that's the number of brain cells who each of us has in his or her brain. That is an incredible number. So where it is sitting and how does the brain actually look like if we look at it. And this is a real image of a brain, one of the ones that we usually capture. And you can see what is here on top is the front, so just behind your front, and left and right side. And you can see that the brain is not just something which looks very similar. It is actually, it seems to have different parts to it, right? There are some areas which are more white, mainly in the middle, and there are some areas which are more gray, mainly on the outside. And we brain scientists, we're not very innovative. That's how we call these different areas. We call it either gray matter or white matter. And essentially, that's exactly how we define them. So if something looks gray, it's gray matter. If something looks white, it's white matter. And we have found out that these two different matters are actually very different and do different things in our brain. The gray matter, as you see, is mainly on the outside of the brain, and that's where these nerve cells, these neurons, are sitting. And all these 86 billion are sitting there on the surface of the brain, and they are the heavy lifters and do all the work in the brain. They are a bit like computers. They are processing information, so they send information from your eye, for example, and they do very, very complex and sophisticated computations, which then lets you, for example, recognize the face. So the brains are like these little computers that are really, really specialized and highly trained for processing information and enabling us to all do all these amazing things that we are doing with our current brains. But the brain is a bit like the internet. There are lots of little computers sitting all around these brain cells, but to really understand everything, they need to be connected. The internet, Google, it only works if we're all connected to the internet. And that's where white matter comes into place, because all of these brain cells are connected with each other, and the white matter, well, that's just the cabling. White matter essentially is just a lot of cables, wires, and the insulation around it. And it's very fatty, that's why it's white. So we can think about gray matter, that's where these brain cells sit, and white matter, that's where the connections are sitting, the roads between the different brain regions. So how do we actually know all about this in the brain? How can we study it? Well, it is quite difficult to study the brain because the skull is pretty thick, and a magnifier glass like this scientist here doesn't really help us because we can't see through the skull, and even a microscope is very difficult. And also, we can't really cut people's head open just to do some research, right? That wouldn't be very nice. So we had to invent alternative measures how to study the brain. And what we came up with is a big machine that is called magnetic resonance imaging, or short for MRI. And that's the machine you saw in the background of the picture I showed you in the beginning. And you might actually know them, because MRIs are nowadays almost in every hospital, because people use them, doctors use them if you have broken your legs or damaged your knee, and so on and so forth. They put you in the MRI to see, to make a picture of your knee. And we use exactly the same technology to make a picture of your brain. And that's the way how we study the brains. And so the MRI is a very, very complicated machine that uses a lot of decades of knowledge about physics. But in essence, you can just think of it as it being a gigantic magnet. And so what they do is they put these gigantic magnets into the hospitals, and what these machines use is the fact that our brain, like everything else in our body, is slightly magnetic. And by using these big magnets, we can understand and we can read out how the brain is shaped. And so in our research, what we do is we take our participants, usually it's more kids rather than teddy bears, and they lie into these scanners, might apply some task, and what we get out is pictures like this where we can see the brain. Unfortunately, the brains or these pictures are usually not delivered by parrots, but just by the machines themselves. So what do we actually see when we use these imaging, these MRIs? Well, we can get two kinds of data. One is the brain structure, and that's essentially what I just told you about. It's to see how big is someone's brain, which brain areas has a lot of gray matter, which one has more white matter, and how does it change over time. So we can say something about the anatomy, how the brain is built. But more recently, we found a way to actually also look at how the brain functions, as in to understand when people are thinking, which brain areas are responsible for that. And so what we do is, if you lie into one of these scanners, we let you play games. We, for example, give you rewards. We might give you some coins or some cookies or something you like. And at the same time, we can look at the brain and see which brain areas are lighting up, which brain areas do like to get reward. And by doing this, we have identified a reward network, areas which we know they really, really, really like if you get something nice. And they fire up and are very active to signal reward. But there are also other brain areas that light up if we make you do something you might not enjoy, like you have to put in a lot of effort, you have to exert a lot of force or do something which is tedious. And we can see that there are other brain areas which are responsible for that. And by doing that, we can understand which areas of the brain are doing different things and which areas are responsible for certain things, and what happens if these areas might be damaged, and how does it affect our perception, how we see, or how we think about things. And by doing this, we have learned a great deal about how the brain works. And we roughly divide the brain into 4 different areas, and you can see here, this is the front with the eye, and when we start at the back, this is what we call the occipital cortex, which is where all the information goes into the brain and is then directly sent into this area. And this area allows you to see, so to recognize that I am a person talking to you. When these signals are then processed a bit further, they might be sent to the parietal cortex, which is the area on top of that, which is really relevant for things like orientation, what is above, what is below, but also for reading and math, all the things that you learn at school. We also have the temporal cortex here on the bottom, and that is a very important area in terms of memory. So whenever you remember something or when you memorize something, that's the brain area which is really important. And last but not least, we have this big green chunk of mass, and that's the area that is the biggest in humans, and that is the area that is responsible for the most complex things that the brain is doing, namely thinking, planning, making decisions, things that don't come easy, things that really uses our brain power and might take quite a long time to really be able to do that. And so the prefrontal cortex is unique in humans because it's very big in humans. And that's what now allows us to all do all these amazing things that other animals might not be able to. And so we are interested not only in understanding what these brain areas do, but also in understanding how they develop. And the reason for this is because when you are born, your brain is small. Actually, a newborn's brain is 4 times smaller than an adult's brain. So the brain itself is expanding immensely. And we also know that different brain areas, as the ones I just told you about, they develop in different stages and different paces. And this tells us about things that children, adolescents, and adults might be able to do or might not yet be able to do. For example, we know that this prefrontal cortex, this host of the most complex of things, is the one brain area that is ripening the last. So, and that is the reason why, for example, you're only allowed to vote when you're 18, or you're only allowed to drive your car between the age of 16 or 18, because all these processes really need a lot of thinking, need a lot of consideration, and are very, very difficult processes. And the brain processes might not yet fully mature in younger children. And this is very important to study, because we want to understand how this develops, when our people, for example, should be allowed to vote, and what happens if it doesn't develop as it should, and how is that related to problems such as mental health. But what we face, the main problem we face, is that we have that our machines that we use to study are really loud and are very expensive, and it takes a lot of time to study. So if we want to take hundreds of children and adolescents to study how the brain develops, we really take a long time. So these studies usually take decades to understand how people develop their brains, and also it is extremely expensive and not doable during the current pandemic, to be honest. And so we were thinking of, well, wouldn't it be cool to really understand brain development, but maybe use it not having to use these big machines? Maybe just use your smartphone and you could do it at home. Well, we were thinking of, well, can we squeeze such a big MRI machine into a smartphone? But unfortunately, the magnet, it just doesn't work. We didn't come up with a solution to do that. But we figured, well, these games I was telling you about, where we give people reward, for example, well, we know what happens in the brain when we can just implement these games into smartphones, and we can study how the brain develops without these big machines. And that's exactly what we did. And I'm very happy to present you now the Brain Explorer app, which is exactly what I did. What I said is, we built an app that you can play from home whenever you want, on your smartphone, on your tablet, and we have used what we know about the brain functions that we usually test in these MRI machines, and we built them into very fun and entertaining games. And now you can actually play these games, and by playing these games, you will allow us to understand how your brain works. So we can understand how which brain functions change over time during development, for example, only by using these simple games, because we know what is happening in these MRI machines. So what is Brain Explorer? Well, Brain Explorer is an app that you can download, which has several fun and entertaining games, and there are new ones coming, being added every now and then. We also ask you some questions about your mood and feelings, so that we are able to link brain functions to mood and feelings. And it's very fun, as you've just seen in the video. There are a lot of different, it's outer space themed. There are lots of different creatures out there, which are quite unusual. And you can earn medals, you can earn stars, and you can compare your scores with your friends and see who is performing better in certain brain games. And this allows us to collect a lot of data and to understand how the brain develops during throughout the entire human life. And the way we do it is because if you play this game, we collect your data and we can analyze that data from all around the world, and we can, by doing this, study the brain. And this is really something that everyone can take part in. And at the moment, already several thousand people across the whole world are playing these games. You can see here in the US, there are lots of people playing, not so many people in Canada, I don't know why. A lot of people played in the UK, and there's also this small little country in the middle of Europe where a lot of people played. Maybe your school teacher knows what this country is. And so all you can do is you can take part and you can play these games, and we get a lot of data. And the data is anonymous. That means we don't know whether you're Jesse from Iowa or Miro from California. All we know is your age and the games that you play and the questions that you answer us. So This allows us to just play and to stay anonymous, and we don't know who you are, but we don't need to know because we have all the other data that we need. And we can use everyone's data as long as they're age 9 or older. All you have to do is you have to say yes to share the data, and your parents also have to say yes. So how does it work? Well, very simple. You can just scan this QR code or go on brainexplorer.net, and you can download the app, or you can directly go to the App Store. When you start the app, you have to tell us your age. You are then get a bit more information about the study, and you then have to consent, which means that you're happy for us to use this data for research purposes. And if you're below 16, also your parents need to say, yes, I think that's a cool thing. Let's let my son, let my daughter play it. And as soon as both have given consent, you can play and explore with space pirates, with milky cows, and with robots. And with having said that, I very much invite you to play the games. I'm sure there are lots of questions. I would like to thank the team that is behind the app together with me. And if you're more interested in the science, all the science that we're doing, here is the website as well. And I think, yeah, let's go for the questions.
Fantastic. Well, Tobias, thank you so much for that. It's the first time in the middle of a presentation I've ever downloaded and started playing a game on an app, which I think is kind of fun. So thank you for that. I'll leave up the website for a minute for people to check it out, but I will bring in the information again if anyone is keen to download this or learn any more. But let's dive in with questions. We have at least 4 other full classrooms joining us on YouTube, so welcome into you guys. We've got groups in Ontario, Alabama, and beyond, so welcome in everybody. If you are on YouTube and you want to share questions in the chat bar, please do. We'll take as many as we can, live or after the fact. But let's dive in with our live classes. I want to come to all our classes in turn. Mr. Fazio's class, they're joining us in Mississauga, Ontario, grade 4 students. If you want to kick us off with a question, come on in.
Sure, welcome. Thank you so much for this presentation. We have a question from one of our grade 4 students, Margaret, who has asked the question, how did you find out that the brain is magnetic?
Oh, well, I haven't found out myself, but a lot of scientists before have. And it goes down to what I said before, which is the brain is 75% is just water. And we know that water has specific magnetic properties. So when you study water, it is also magnetic. You will probably not see it with your normal magnet. But if you have a very big magnet like we do, then you can actually see it. And we actually just use that simple fact that water is slightly differently distributed in different parts of the brain. And that is all behind the magic. And that's how we get all these beautiful images that I was showing you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I was going to ask that if no one did, so I appreciate that. Let's head to Ms. Ball's class. They're grade 11s joining us in Goderich. If you guys have a question, or if Ms. Ball herself does, come on in. Hey, guys.
We just want to know a little bit about Tobias's education pathway and how many years he's been in school and what he studied.
That is a very good question. Yes, so I'm originally from Switzerland, where I did normal school, I did high school. I then went to university a couple of years, did my undergrad and my graduate degree. I ended up doing a PhD, and at university I studied psychology because I was very interested in, well, what is happening in there. And during my studies, that's when a lot of this brain science actually started to emerge, and that just really fascinated me. So that's why I started doing a PhD in psychology and using all these brain scanners to understand. And I finished my PhD probably 7 years ago. And since then, I have been a full-time researcher and doing a lot of research in different countries. And by now, I have my own research group. And yeah, we do all this research that I've just been talking about.
Yeah, and I love this. I love highlighting educational journeys because I know for kids in grade 11, for kids in grade 4, that much extra education on top of grade 12 can seem daunting. But if you do it, you end up like Tobias, where instead of, annoying your parents with your smartphone, you get paid to use a smartphone, which is pretty fun. So lots of neat opportunities out there. Thank you so much, Miss Ball, for the question. So we've got a few classes with some interesting situations. Miss Saunders, thank you for typing your question in the chat bar. I'll share that in just a minute. Mr. Bray's class, I would come to you guys right now if you have a question for us. Perfect. So yeah, Mr. Bray's class, Miss Little was with us earlier. They are joining us in Dutton, Ontario. Come on in if you have any questions for us.
We do have a question. It's kind of two parts. How does a concussion impact the normal development of a brain? And could you recognize a concussed brain just from the data that you gather through the app?
Very good questions. I take the second first, and I'd say no, probably not. Concussions are, as you know, they have a very, like, when you're currently just had a concussion, then you probably feel very bad. And like having had one myself, you probably can't see very well. So you probably don't want to play the games because you might have difficulty understanding them. So in the MRI, actually, when someone had a concussion, we often don't really see it, and we often don't really use these MRI images to diagnose a concussion. We can just diagnose that purely behaviorally based on your symptoms that you have, the headache, and so on and so forth. If it is a really bad concussion and it leads to, for example, bleeding or some hemorrhage in the brain, that's when it's really important to use these MRI machines, because they can tell us which brain areas are affected and what can we do to intervene and to make the brain good again. And that's when these machines come into play.
Fantastic question, guys. And I want to note for our classes in Ontario, we actually have a lot of concussion research going on. Two friends of mine are twins that have been doing a lot of this. So I'll share that with some of our classes later. If you're keen on concussions, there's a lot out there in the GTA that you can learn about, which is really cool. All right, Miss Spiegel's class. So Miss Spiegel's class is joining us today in, want to find me. There we go, Ardmore, Pennsylvania. Nice to have an American class with us. Come on in, Miss Spiegel.
Hi. So we actually had a few questions, but I'll just do with one. Do you study kids from different places to see how brains are different?
Well, yes and no. So in the app, that's one of the things we want to look at, right? So as you've seen probably from the world map, we have people from all over the world. So we can start looking and comparing how are kids in the US playing it differently from kids in Europe and not. What we do here more locally, because it's more difficult to fly in people from the US, we usually study different groups within the UK, within Great Britain. But there are big initiatives of brain researchers all around the globe that bring their data together. And so we compare data of like populations in the US and populations in India and so on and so forth. So we can compare how different cultural environments shape our brain development.
Cool question, guys. I love that. I want to head to Miss Colhane's class. They're live, and then we'll go and take Miss Saunders on the chat bar and some YouTube ones in a minute. So Miss Colhane's class is joining us in Georgetown. Just unmute your microphone, and you are good to go.
Okay. Well, we have a few questions. I typed two in the chat, but another one I had was how can we use how does using a growth mindset help grow our brain?
Well, so the brain is the brain is an organ that is what we call plastic. It's changeable. So I told you about how the brain develops during development, but also we can actually change how the brain looks like. So there are a lot of studies, for example, looking at musicians, which show that certain brain areas which are important for music are bigger than in non-musicians. There are also even studies that let people train to juggle balls for a month or two, and they show that certain brain areas which are responsible for the juggling are bigger. So it really suggests that we can, if we study something and if we're interested in something and if we put our heads down and really go for it, then that changes our brain. So If you're really excited about something, if you practice something a lot, that will change your brain. And that's essentially all you do at school is you're practicing math and language and so on and so forth. And that pushes your brain to grow and to get better in these specific functions.
Yeah, that was a great answer. I love that. Actually, before we dive in with our last few questions, I want to switch up the background for just 2 seconds for you. So, Tobias, before we got underway, I was saying that we had a brain background, but I wanted to give Tobias the chance to have an epic volcano background. But it's not
Oh, yes, please.
otherwise, so we'll have a volcano as a background for one question.
Amazing.
I can't resist. Miss Saunders' class is joining us. Ooh, this is very exciting. So they're in Wilmington, Delaware. So I want to do a plug for their classroom that in about a month and a half, you guys should go check out the horseshoe crabs in your beaches because it's one of the coolest things in all of nature. But that's aside. Ms. Saunders' class wants to know, do we all have the same amount of brain cells, Tobias? Or is it different between?
Difficult one. Probably not. But it's very difficult to compare. So we can't look at the actual amount of brain cells. What we know is that our brains are differently big. And in fact, for example, females' brains are smaller than males' brains, but that doesn't mean much because obviously women on average are also slightly smaller than men. And the actual brain size doesn't tell you much about intelligence or anything. And to underline this argument, did you know that Neanderthals, they had bigger brains than us and they were not smarter than us because they got extinct? So we have different sizes, different number of brain cells, but they don't necessarily tell us much about how the brain functions.
Very, very cool, guys. I love these sort of backed up questions. I'm sorry, I removed the volcano, Tobias. You had your moment of glory there.
Okay.
We're going to take a few quick questions from our YouTube groups. You guys have had such great questions. I love it. So there's been several questions on the nature of ADHD. Can you identify ADHD in the brain? Is it a neurological difference that we can actually see in something like an MRI? And then as a follow-up to that, brain differences that show on MRIs in general, ADHD, dyslexia, do those sort of things show up when you're looking at scans?
This is a brilliant question because, like, I've done my PhD on ADHD and I was trying to find out brain differences between people with ADHD and without. And the answer is it's complicated, but we're working towards it. So we see differences if we take groups and we see certain brain areas to be different. And that's also like why we know that certain medications are working. So we know that certain brain chemicals are working slightly differently in people with ADHD, and that's why these medications that we give people with ADHD, because that's why they work. But what we can't use yet, we can't yet use a brain scan to tell apart or diagnose an ADHD. That's not where we're at. But part of the research that we have here and that we do with this app with Brain Explorer is also to look at these what we call individual differences and see whether some people are maybe a bit more impulsive than others and whether they behave differently on these brain games.
Fantastic. How neat is that? No, what a nice coincidence that you actually did your PhD research.
Yes, pure coincidence. Great.
I love this question from Miss Huxley's class. They're joining us in Calvin. They want to know, do food choices like eating junk food affect your brain in any way?
Ooh, interesting one. Okay, I'm not an expert in that, full disclosure. But what we know is that the brain, at least the brain size and brain consistency in certain areas are related to some things like the body mass index and your nutritional choices. We know that obviously, if you are malnourished, that impacts your brain because I told you, it has a lot of water, a lot of fat, and all of these minerals and so on, all these substances are taken out of what we eat. So if we don't get enough of that, that definitely negatively impacts.
Yeah, great question, guys. All right, unfortunately, again, we've had too much fun here. We're running out of time, so I want to take one more question from Ms. Tanui's class. They're joining us in Toronto, and they want to know, have you personally ever had an MRI? I know I'd love to have an MRI, but it'd be so cool to see inside my own brain. How about you, Tobias?
I had dozens of them. So, we don't put kids into these boards before we haven't tested them 100 times ourselves. So we are the guinea pigs of our own research. We are in these machines. I have lying in these machines for hours and hours and hours. And I have to tell you, I've always fallen asleep by now because it's so comfortable for me. So I'm a terrible participant because as soon as you put me in, I'm asleep.
Okay. I had figured it might be the case that you'd had lots, but that's a great anecdote. I love that. Tobias, this has been so much fun, man. What I want to do is make sure people at home, again, if you want to learn more, Tobias is on Twitter at Tobias Hauser. You can check out more about his lab at devcomc.org. And of course, if you want to download the Brain Explorer app, you can do that on Google Play, you can do that on the App Store, and you can check it out on brainexplorer.net. I really encourage you to do so. I've been having, again, I actually did download this in the middle just to see how fast it was. It was a lot of fun. Played 2 games. It was great. So I appreciated the chance to learn a little bit about my own brain right there. So thank you so much, Tobias.
Amazing. Well, thanks so much for having me, Jesse.
Yeah, so what we do at the end of every broadcast is,
Yes.
I'm not just thanking you, I'm going to bring in all our teachers in classrooms and they can do a big goodbye and thank you as well.
Great.
Miss Ball, Mr. Fazio, Mr. Bray, Miss Spiegel, and Miss Colhane, if you want to join me in saying a big thank you and farewell,